Our story begins in Chicago, where German and Bohemian immigrants decided they wanted to come up north, and they looked for a place and settled on the mouth of the Shelda Creek on the western shore of Good Harbor Bay. And a number of families came here, but two of them in particular are important to our story. The Joseph and Mary Bergman with their daughter Mary, who was 7 years old, and Nicodemus and Anna Tabor were two of the families. I might mention the Wickern family was one of those as well, or very shortly after that. The Bergmans bought this 160 acres and moved here, I know by record, by March 1860. They may have come here before that. In 1858, they had a son, Edward. So just take a moment to imagine what they came to. It's very difficult, I think, to imagine, but this was all wilderness. There were no roads except Indian trails, and there were trees everywhere. And two of the trees that survived, I believe, are the maple tree on the right of the driveway and the oak tree on the left. They're pretty big trees. That's what was here. Trees like that. And if you look across M22, there's a ridge there, and that ridge starts at Sugarloaf Mountain down the ways and kind of ends up close to the end of the property. And on the other side, there's what we always called a swamp. It's a valley, and correct language today is wetlands, and that extends almost the length of the farm as well. And the southwest corner of the 160 acres that they bought was also marshland. There are a couple springs there that form a creek and goes into Little Traverse Lake. The boundaries of the 160 acres, the northern boundary is about right here where we're sitting. East and west, between the barn and the chicken coop. The eastern boundary is Town Line Road, the southern boundary is Little Traverse Lake Road, and the southwest corner of this 160 acres is actually wet in Little Traverse Lake, depending on how high the water is. And then the western boundary back up. The Bergmans built a log cabin in the valley, which is just, when you walk around you'll see it, just north of the house. At least that's what Leonard Kropp said. He was a neighbor. And he thought, the story he heard was they built a log cabin down there. Now I might as well mention that if you look over to the chicken coop, there's the side and the back of that are logs. We believe that was that log cabin, what's left of it. And what happened is, this is my theory, they discovered that they built a cabin not on their property. So they bought another 40 acres just north of here, and that's where the cabin is. And that property is sandy hill and all trees, and still is. Although, yeah, get ahead of my story here. Then the other family, Nicodemus and Mary and Anna Tabor, tragedy came to them in 1861 when Anna and their two infant daughters died. They're buried in Cleveland Township Cemetery, and that's the extent of what I know about them. But Nicodemus then, or Nicodem, as he's called in some places, tried to homestead a place in Section 28 near St. Joseph Catholic Church after the Homestead Act was passed in 1862. But according to the Grand Traverse Herald in 1865, he had abandoned that property. Also that year, he had registered for the draft in Glen Arbor. The war ended in April 1865, the Civil War that is, in case you don't remember your history. So I doubt he went in the military service. The next thing we know about them, for sure, is Joseph and Mary Bergman were in Chicago in 1870 census without Edward. So it's safe to assume that Edward had died. And Nicodemus had married Mary Bergman and living in Chicago by 1869 where their first child was born, and they stayed in Chicago. So it's reasonable to me to say they did not live here, no one lived here, since as early as 1865. And I'll get back to when our grandfather arrived. But I want to say something else that is going on, because this is part of my story, connect it with what else is happening in Little County. In 1863, Captain Harvey Feet, who was a sailor on the Great Lakes for 20 years, decided to settle down, and he settled down in Section 2 of Cleveland Township, on the shore, with a dock and a store and a sawmill. He, and with partnership with Otto Thies, or Thies of Leland, I don't know how to pronounce that. And Fayette left in 1869 to go to New York, and Thies then built a dock in Section 1 on Lake Michigan, and a sawmill, and a store, and that would be just north of the buildings here, probably no more than a half a mile. So it's very close. And the reason I say that is this is not as isolated as we might think, going back to that time period when it was wilderness. People were coming in. Now I move the story to Bohemia. In 1859, Faustin Bufka decided he wanted to immigrate to the United States, where his sister had immigrated a year before. And so he got permission from the Prussian government to be exempt from military service, and sailed on the maiden voyage of the Goshen in May 1859 and arrived 36 days later in New York. From there he went to Holyoke, Massachusetts, where Barbara was, and he began to call himself Charles at that point. Now Faustin remains on the record because the tombstone at Cleveland Township Cemetery says Faustin Bufka. But he was, in any records, he's Charles from then on. I don't know what happened between 1860 and 1866. He may have been in the military, but I've not been able to find that record. But in 1866, he was in Chicago. He was a blacksmith at a farm machinery company. And it's interesting to note that he was there during the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. And I haven't located exactly where the fire was and how close, but I think he lived fairly close to that. And after the fire, he worked at a different place, raising the question in my mind, was the first place burned out in the fire? But Faustin continued to live there. Charles continued to live in Chicago. Now, Bergmans and Tabors were already in Chicago. In 1872, the fourth family that's important for this story decided to immigrate from Moravia to the United States in 1872. Mattis and Josephine Hodeve and their two daughters, Anna and Frances, and Mattis's daughter from his first marriage, Mariana, or Mary, immigrated to the United States. Guess where they went? Chicago. So all four families, Charles Bufka, Hodeve family, Bergman family, and Tabor family, are all living in Chicago. And as ethnic groups do, they stick together. So it's very likely, very likely that they met and knew each other there. And this is important. I'll show you why in a minute. So Charles met Mary Hodeve, fell in love, we might say today. I don't know what happened, but somehow they did, and decided that they wanted to get married. Well, then Charles was disappointed because Hodeve family moved to Little Nuckoutty. On Nuckazo Road, he had a farm, 80 acres. That's just north of Lime Lake on off Maple City Road, for those of you who don't know. And so I'm assuming, this is guesswork, that Charles probably came up north to visit Mary, and with the docks that were here, and also on the other side of Pyramid Point, Port Oneida, there's a dock there by that time. He could easily do that. That's what travel was in those days, by boat. And then once he got here, to travel over. And at the same time, or about the same time, he learned about the 200 acres that was for sale here by Nicodemus Tabor. So he checked it out, came to the dock at Tice, just on the lake, very close, and checked it out, and decided he wanted to move here. That's speculation. It's based on these three facts. On September 12, 1880, Charles recorded the purchase with the Register of Deeds in Leland, that he purchased these 200 acres. In October, he built this house. The first part of it, about 22 feet square, 2-story with a cellar. And on November 10th, 1880, he married Mary. That's pretty fast. So I made up the story that happened, but I think it's very plausible that they met in Chicago, and that's what was going on. He didn't come up here and all of a sudden do all these things. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised that he started building this house before October. It got completed in October. Now, next part of the story moved next door. I mentioned the two docks on Lake Michigan. Well, Garrett Vinn came in the 1870s and set up a sawmill in Section 6, which is just across Town Line Road. However, that was not successful, and he left. But by another family that moved here in North Unity was Charles Kropp, and so he'd been in the area for 20 years, and he decided with his sons to build a dock on Lake Michigan, a bigger dock, and it was 550 feet long, 50 feet wide, and was large enough to hold 4 schooners at the same time. I don't know how big a schooner is, but you can imagine that's pretty good size. And he owned the dock, and of course that's how he made money, by people docking there, stopping there. And so that set the stage for the Schomburg brothers, Otto and Henry Schomburg, to come up and set up a sawmill at Good Harbor. The dock, by the way, if you're familiar with Good Harbor Beach, there are pilings in the water, which now are underwater, but when I was a kid, they were all visible. That's where the dock was. And the sawmill would have been on the shore, just right across from that dock. So they set up a sawmill, and I just want to add a little thing about Otto. Otto was torn between being here and being a National League baseball player. Isn't that cool? A guy from Good Harbor, Michigan on a National League. I think he chose National League because their partnership broke up. And then a third Schomburg, Dick Schomburg, Richard Schomburg, took over the business. Henry Schomburg stayed in the area, started raising horses, and lived on Schomburg Road, named for him, and near where Schomburg Depot was, which locals will know where that is, on Schomburg Road. I'll get back to that a little later. The reason I mention this now is because I believe Charles Bufka, some of his income, let me start over on that. He had all these trees, and he wanted to get rid of them because he wanted to farm, and so he decided to sell those trees. But he was farming. I almost forgot. In 1884, there was an agricultural census, and this is what it said about Charles Bufka Farm right here.
On June 1st, 1884, the United States government conducted an agricultural census that showed Charles Bufka tilled 20 acres. 140 acres were woodland, and another 40 were unimproved. On the tilled land, 2 acres yielded 40 bushels of oats, 2 acres produced 10 bushels of rye, and 4 acres yielded 10 bushels of winter wheat in 1883. 2 acres were sown in oats, 2 in rye, 5 in winter wheat, and 1 in spring wheat. 1 acre of potatoes produced 30 bushels. In 1883, the farm also had 2 horses and 2 milk cows, but no mules, sheep, or swine. 2 calves were born. 1 was sold alive and the other slaughtered. The soil was sand. The value of the farm was $600, and the livestock was worth $50.
Right, thank you. So he definitely was farming. But I don't know anything else about his farming between then and the early 1900s. But I believe, he had to have a barn, right? I believe he took the log cabin that was in the valley, brought it up and put it down south of the buildings here, which corresponds to what John told me recently, that's where our dad said the log cabin was. It was in the field, down south a little bit. It makes sense to me that he moved that up here to be a barn. Now, I'm sure there had to be other buildings, but we don't know what they are. John and I both remember a very old building between the shop and the barn that held implements And but there must have been some others too, because they had to have a place for the granary to store grain and so on. So we can assume that happened, but we have no record of what they were, or where they were, how big they were. So now, in putting a couple things together, the story in the family is that Joseph, oh no, I jumped ahead of myself. I got to tell you who these people were first, before I talk about them. Charles and Mary Bufka had 5 children: Carrie, Anna, Edward, Celia, and Joseph. Joseph was our father. Carrie Bufka, when I'm saying that because I skipped something. The Mary Hodeve, the Hodeves were from Moravia, I mentioned. I learned from my cousin Don Deco that the custom in Moravia was for the girls to do the barn work, clean the stalls, feed the animals, milk the cows. And that was the tradition here. His mother, Anna, told him that. So here's another guess. They decided, this is not for me. And as soon as they're old enough, guess where they went? Chicago. So all 3 of them were in Chicago at the same time for a while. Carrie Bufka returned to Leelanau, married a neighbor, Clarence Kilway, and lived that way half a mile. And Anna Bufka came back when their father, Charles, had cancer of the mouth and needed help, and so she came to help out. And then stayed here. She did not return, but she didn't just stay at the farm. She worked out. She worked for a while. She worked at D.H. Day. She also not D.H. Day Park, but the family, and the Manny family anyway. And it's through working there that she met John Deco, who just recently had lost his wife, and they married. And so and Paul Deco, those of you who know Paul Deco, my Aunt Anna would be his step-grandmother. And then Edward was what we would say today developmentally disabled. At least that's the way I would describe it. I really don't know. I can honestly tell you I never had a conversation with the man. I saw him, visited with him, and he'd look at me quizzically like he didn't know what I was talking about. John, is that your experience?
What was your experience?
And yeah, so, and I think the reason is he didn't learn English very well. He spoke Bohemian because our dad would go to visit Aunt Carrie or anybody that spoke Bohemian and speak Bohemian all the time. I didn't know what they were talking about, but I know my uncle talked Bohemian. Okay. Then Celia stayed in Chicago and worked her entire life and died there and never married. And we had cousins. My dad had cousins in Chicago as well, but I won't get into that. That's unnecessary. Now, Joseph Bufka, our dad, met Agnes Schaefer, who was a maid in Leland at the Mitchell house. On her day off, they met, and it's hard to believe, but they played in Lake Michigan. I can't think of them as young and having fun on the beach, but I'm sure they did. And our dad had red hair, I understand. He played the fiddle. He was kind of a great guy to be around in his 20s and 30s. Well, in the 1920s, I should say. That's the period we're talking about. Anyway, they fell in love, as the saying goes, and they got married. Agnes was from Madison, Indiana, 500 miles south, on the Ohio River, just 50 miles south of Cincinnati. So Joseph Bufka bought a 1928 Buick sedan, drove down for the wedding, and brought his wife back, as well as his best man, Jim Kreitz. Can you imagine that? The day after you get not day, but after you get married, you bring your wife and your best man back in the same car. That sounds like something interesting. Anyway, then Joseph and Agnes had 6 sons. Joe and Jerome were twins. And I was told that Mom did not know that she was having twins until the day before. Wouldn't that be something? And then Raymond and Kenneth, John, and me. I'm not going to go through what they did because I don't think that's significant for us, but I just wanted you to know there were. All of them lived around here except me. I moved away in 10th grade and never came back to live. But I love this place, as I mentioned before, and I love talking about it. It's a great story. I may as well mention now Kenny, whom most of you never heard of, except Larry and some others our age. He died when he was 12 years old. And I was 6 at the time, and John, I believe, was 9 or 10. Anyway, I'll say a little bit more about that later. So there's the family. Now, in July when I was talking, I don't know if some of you remember this, but I was telling you things, and I said, light bulb came on. Do you remember that? And I thought, wow. Well, this is the light bulb experience, based on fact, but some conjecture. All right, Joseph Bufka finished 6th grade at Shetland School, and I'll talk more about Shetland School in a bit, in 1904. And his father decided it was time for him to learn the farm trade and build up this farm more deliberately, more intentionally. And take a look, just briefly, take a look at the buildings here, in case I know you've done it already, but just take a look. I believe this is a picturesque setting from M22, sitting right here, wherever you look. People, when I was a kid, people would stop by and take pictures. I saw pictures of this place in calendars. I saw artists stop up there and set up their board and paint a picture of these buildings. My point in saying that is, I don't think it's accidental that this looks great. I think it was all planned. And the plan began in 1907. The dates I give are factual. It's the other part that's a little bit sketchy. I'm kind of guessing. So I think Charles and Joseph decided we're going to get this farm going. In 1907, they built a stone wall from the end of the barn to almost the garage. Why would they build a stone wall? I've often wondered that. And this is the light bulb that came to me. It's at the top of the valley, so the logical answer would be to keep rain, water from pushing the sand down into the valley. But I think it really has to do with the barn. What you see in the barn is the main floor, right? And those of you who walk down there, you know there's another level under that entire barn. There's a lower level, mostly underground. Underground because it's warmer. Well, to do that underground, to have the underground, they had to do something with that earth, right? Where would they put it? That's why they built the wall. They put it all along the wall, evened it out, leveled it out, not leveled perfectly, but smoothed it out, and built the driveway down to the lower level and back up on the other side. Had that all formed. I think that's the connection. I think that's why they built the stone wall. So the barn was built in 1909. In 1910, Felix Darga built and erected this cupola on top of the barn for $10. That's in the book. I'm not making it up. In 1911, they dug a well in the barn. And in 1913, they finished the cement work in the barn basement, the lower level. Now I believe that they built a granary at this time, or maybe the granary was built before. I mean, I don't know. In 1911, they built a shop, which is the building behind the farthest over, which has a forge and an anvil and had other equipment in it when I was a kid. I can talk about that more later when we take the tour, or not. But it also had a stove, so it was easy to go over there and work in the wintertime when farm work wasn't as active. In 1911 also, Joseph Bufka bought lightning rods to put on the house, the barn, and the shop. The three most important buildings. Seems like I'm missing something. Oh yeah. The barn, the old log cabin, which is down in the field, they brought over here, and which is used as a chicken coop the whole time that John and I were living here. And Joseph Bufka rebuilt the front, and I think the Lakeshore Preserve restored the front later again, not that long ago. And as far as I can remember, there's just the back wall and this side wall are logs. The others, apparently the others had worn away or whatever. He added a lean-to on the left side over there, and he raised the roof for storage above. And all that ties in with the next part of the story. I don't think I'm missing something. What did they sell? They decided to have products for sale besides just taking care of themselves. In July, I told you this is a self-sufficient farm or a general farm. It was. But I discovered in these notes, after looking at them again, that there was much more intention than providing for themselves. Because in 1913 to 1919, Joseph kept a ledger of things that were grown and sold. And there were four main products: cream, butter, eggs, and potatoes. Potatoes were a big crop for many people in this area at that time. One year, he sold $500 worth of potatoes. That is pretty darn good considering the time. Average farm income in that time period was about $500 a year. And one year, and he recorded in his ledger, the income was $1,700. So he wasn't just selling, it wasn't just growing things to maintain the animals and the family. They were growing things to sell. And these things continued. I remember going with my dad to the creamery in Cedar many times when I was growing up. That ended, I'm not sure what year it ended, but it ended, I think I have a note on this. I think it ended in 1951 when we stopped having cows. There was no cream. But other things were sold as well over the years. Well, before I get into that, behind me is a kind of a teardrop-shaped area. Can you see it? Am I describing it right?
It doesn't look like that anymore.
It doesn't. Oh, okay. Anyway, in front of the house. Maybe walnut trees right here, right?
Yes.
Okay, over there. Anyway, that was a flower garden. That whole area. So that was a lot of work. There's a vegetable garden east of the garage. And so we sold some vegetables, flowers, over the years as well, and chickens. Next. What am I missing? I think we moved to, next major part of what I wanted to share with you is it's easy to think that in 1880, 1900, people were isolated because they didn't have the communication and travel that we have today. I mean, today, for heaven's sakes, you'd call up somebody on a cell phone anywhere in the world, right? And you got instant communication. We didn't have that. So I mistakenly thought, and I wrote this in my Good Harbor book, isolated. People were in isolation. I don't accept that anymore. The Bufka farm and family was in the center of activity. And I'll tell you why. Good Harbor, am I pointing in the right direction? That way? Was a village growing with a sawmill and so on. There were as many as 100 people living there. And Larry may know more about this than what I do. But there was a main street. There were a lot of activity going on. There was one little interesting story about it. somebody wanted to set up a bar, a tavern, whatever, saloon, whatever you want to call it, and they couldn't do it because Centerville Township was a dry township. So what they do? They went across the Town Line Road and set up one in Cleveland Township, which was just north of here. So that's how close we are to Good Harbor. Good Harbor was a center of activity for 25 years at least. It was even considered a place, a possible place for the county seat for Leelanau County. Unfortunately, the sawmill burned down in 1906, and Dick Schomburg, who was in charge then, did not rebuild the sawmill, which is understandable because logging was no longer profitable. They logged all the trees that were available. But he kept the dock going and encouraged people here to sell their farm products, potatoes, and bring in manufactured goods from Chicago and other places to keep it going. And he did that until the mid-1920s when he sold, I guess he owned the buildings. He sold all the buildings to John Peters in Leland, who tore them down for salvage. And so that's why when you go down to Good Harbor Beach, there is no evidence or very little evidence of anything ever being there. But I say all that because in this thriving little village, telegraph was there in the mid-1880s. Telephone was in Good Harbor Village for business about the same time period. So there's communication. And this road was here as early as 1873. I have a map that shows that road. So this is not isolated. It was very much connected. And on this road in the 1880s, a stagecoach went from Northport to Glen Arbor 3 times a week. I know, I think it's funny too. When I first learned that, I thought, stagecoach in Leelanau? I thought that was out west. And I did some more research on that. And I was surprised at the stagecoach lines in Michigan. There were at least 30 stagecoach lines in Detroit. So that was not only, now part of it was for mail, but it was also for travel. People could get on the stagecoach. The next would be the telephone. Joseph Bufka and neighbors set up the Good Harbor Telephone Company. Some of this is a little sketchy, but the company definitely existed. I do know that. There's evidence of it at the Leelanau Historical Society. And in 1913, they set up the company. They set up their own poles and lines, and they had phone service that early. And it's a party line, and continued to be a party line when I was a kid. And of course, a party line, if you're familiar with it, you recognize your ring. Our ring was 2 longs and a short, as I recall. And if you got that on the phone, you answered it. If you didn't, if it was somebody else's phone, you didn't get on the phone. However, people did, and listened in on conversations when they weren't supposed to. An interesting thing that I learned about when I was studying this, researching this, one of the rules of the phone company was if a business wanted the phone line, you had to get off. You could not be on the phone for fun if the business wanted to have a phone conversation. And there were fines for violating that. The next, let's see, post office. For those of you who are not familiar with how post offices worked in the 1900s, they were at people's homes. The postmaster had his post office at his home or business. And there's a Good Harbor post office as early as 1866, but it was not in what we consider Good Harbor today. It was closer to Shetland, where Shetland School is. But the last post office in Good Harbor was at Ben Minsker Store, which was on the corner of Town Line Road and M22. And if I could see, and if it was still there, you could see it from here. So that's how close the post office was. That's not true for a lot of people. So the Bufka family and the farm was not isolated at all. We were right in the middle of all these developments that were taking place. I said it was the last post office because rural free delivery began in 1907, and mail was routed here from Maple City, and later Cedar, and I forget what year it changed to Cedar. That reminds me of a little story. When I went away to school in the 10th grade, in the seminary, people would ask where I was from. Well, since it was a seminary and I was Catholic and I was there because I wanted to be a priest, my first response was I was from St. Joseph's Bohemian Settlement, which is, if you know where that is, on Bohemian Road, over a few miles. But our postal address was Cedar, and I went to school in Leland. Where am I from? I was confused. Okay. This is going faster than I thought it would, which is good, because I couldn't be here for 2 hours. Is it 45 minutes yet?
Not quite.
Not quite,
The
okay.
train,
Okay, good.
trains.
Oh yeah, oh yes, thank you. Train was another one. There was a lot of, okay, the train first came to Traverse City in 1872. Now, Traverse City in those days was a long ways away from here. Well, not literally, it's the same distance now as it was then. But there wasn't much in between, is what I'm getting at. It was the Grand Rapids Railroad, I forget the exact name of it, Grand Rapids in Indiana, I believe. Well, that changed, and there was lobbying. I remember reading the Leelanau Enterprise, and there was lobbying to get a train into Leelanau County. Eventually, one did near Empire, but the one important for us is the Manistee and Northeastern. Some people get confused by that and think it should be Northwestern because this is Northwestern Michigan. But it is Northeastern. Manistee is southwest of us. So when they ran the track from Manistee, they were going northeast. And they ran it through the southern part of Leelanau County. Solon, Fouch were all big names when I was a kid, and depots on the train station, on the rail. That was in 1893, I think, 1892. In 1903, they ran a spur. Well, actually, they started the spur earlier, but they ran a spur from Solon to Cedar to Bodus to Schaumburg and Lake Leelanau. So if you can kind of picture that through the center part of the county. I mentioned Schaumburg Depot earlier. That's about 2 miles from here, east. My guess anyway, I could be wrong. So that too is accessible. And in my dad's notes, he talked about taking the train from Schaumburg to Traverse City, shopping for the day and coming back. Round trip fare was $1.11. Now the
Shetland School.
auto,
Shetland School.
which?
Shetland.
Oh yeah, well no, wait, I'll do that in a minute. Yeah, thanks. Automobile is the other one. And a couple other ones, yeah. There is a note that they bought a truck in 1908, but there's nothing else about it. So I'm not quite sure how much validity there is to that or what it all means. But I would guess that Charles Bufka bought that. And that kind of is intriguing to think that he was that forward thinking that he would buy a truck. But that ties in with the buildings that I was talking about earlier. Probably the garage then could have been a 2-bay garage built around that time period. Or maybe later, where Joseph Bufka, in his own words, said he bought a Dodge touring car in 1917 from Frank Kurt, and Frank taught him how to drive. And Kurt's a common name in the area, by the way, for those of you who are not natives. And that's when maybe the 2-bay garage was built, okay? And the other 2 buildings that are here, I may as well bring them up now. The outhouse, which you can't see from here probably, but it's behind the house a little bit, and the smokehouse. They're both about the same size, but obviously 2 different purposes. The smokehouse, I loved the smokehouse when I was a kid because it retained the aroma of smoked meat for days after smoking was done. So, and I believe those were built about the same time, but I really don't know. I have no record of that. And other buildings, there was an ice house between the chicken coop and the house. And when I was a kid, pretty young, we still had an ice box, so we still had ice in that ice house. And your layers, the blocks of ice would be separated by sawdust so that they're easy to take out when needed. Larry Wicken's dad cut ice in the Little Traverse Lake, and so I'm sure we bought ice from him. I have a record of buying ice from somebody else in Lake Luna. That ended for sure in 1954 when my dad bought this first refrigerator. The other building, since I'm talking about buildings, was a brooder coop, which would be south of the shop in a field. That would be a small, about 10 or 12 feet square for baby chicks as they were brought in. And I'm still fascinated by this, and I'll share it with you. Mom bought 100 baby chicks, and they were delivered by mail. Can you believe that? A box about that high, about that square with holes in so they could breathe. Rarely did more than one or two die on the trip. And then we put them in there, and baby chicks are so cute. And then they grow up to be ugly. Anyway, speaking of chickens, that was my job when I was old enough to do it. I fed the chickens and took care of them and gathered the eggs. And when Mom wanted a chicken for dinner, I went out, took a hook, grabbed one of them, took it out to the chopping block, held the wings tightly to the body, put its neck down, and they were very docile. Just laid there like, okay, go ahead. Chop the head off and hold on to the wings for sure. You've heard the phrase, flopping around like a chicken with its head cut off. It literally is true. If I didn't hold on to those wings, that's exactly what it would do. And of course it would bruise the meat. And so Mom was very insistent, hold those wings. Okay, Shetland School. All of Charles Bufka's kids and Joseph Bufka's kids, John and me, went to Shetland School. I, however, had the fortune of only going kindergarten. Shetland School District agreed to be annexed to Leland Public School in 1947, and so I went to Leland for the next 9 years. John and Larry and Ivan graduated from there in 1956. And we took the bus. Okay, Shetland School was a one-room school. I happened to mention this to somebody the other day that I went to one-room school, and he said, huh? He had no idea what I was talking about. Of course, he's only 20 years old. But I don't know what else there is to say about it. Don't be deceived by the date on that building. It says 1871. That building was not that old. I mean, the site, it was not at that site in 1871. So I believe, based on that it was moved from a different place. There was a school on the southwest corner of Maple City Road and M22 in 1880. And I think that's what was moved to this location later. And there was an addition put on there. There were so many Bohemians at that school. They spoke Bohemian, and the teacher had to tell them not to speak Bohemian in school. And I get that information from Adolf Fiskachel, who was 6 years younger than my dad, and he recalled that in his notes about his life. Let's see. Next is life on the farm, I guess.
You're about 45 minutes.
Yeah, good. Okay, this is perfect. I'm talking too fast, apparently, because I had about 2 hours worth. No, life on the farm. In my book, From Bohemia to Good Harbor, I wrote about life, a long chapter on life on the farm. I'm not going to duplicate that here, but I just want to get some snippets of life on this farm, to kind of interest you or intrigue you or some different things. Before I do that, I forgot a very important product that we sold. In the 1940s, we began tapping trees and making maple syrup. And that continued for about 30 years. And John and Joe were doing that when they sold the land to the park. But that last few years, they had 1,200 taps and were making 200 to 300 gallons of syrup a year. So that's pretty good. When I was a kid, we weren't making more than 30 or 40 gallons probably. Okay. I forgot what I was.
Life on the farm.
Life on the farm, yes. Okay. For those of you who are not familiar with farm life, I mean, daily chores is something that you just can't avoid. You have to take care of the animals. You have to feed them. You have to milk the cows. You have to feed the chickens. You have to gather the eggs. So that's a daily routine, not to mention all the things in the house that my mom did, preparing meals, picking vegetables, and planting. And so seasonally, there's the planting and the taking care of the fields and harvesting, which reminds me of these buildings are well located for threshing. I remember the threshing machine coming here, Linus Kilby. Can you imagine pulling a thresh machine down that driveway? Think about that. He went pretty slow, right, John? Pretty slow. But he could bring it down here, turn it around into the driveway, line it up to the garage, blow the straw into the straw mow on the left, and the grain would come out on this side near the granary into bags, and there would be a short distance carrying the bags into the granary. Very convenient, very convenient. The granary also is convenient for taking feed from there to the barn or the chicken coop. I mentioned already, but I want to repeat it. They had a vegetable garden east of the garage. We grow the typical vegetables. I mean, lettuce and radishes and carrots, and there are some potatoes there too, probably sweet corn, which reminds me of a little story. One night, I woke up the most horrendous screeching, scared the heck out of me. I woke up my brother Ray and I said, "What is going on?" He said, "Those are just raccoons fighting in the cornfield, fighting over the corn." It was awful. Okay, I mentioned okay. Something else that really surprised me about life on this farm, my dad sold skunk pelts. Can you imagine capturing a skunk and getting this pelt off to sell? And I thought, well, this is ridiculous. But I Googled it, as we do these days, and found that skunk pelts were held in very high esteem and very valuable. There was millions sold for a time period in the early 1900s. That just amazed me. Another thing about life on the farm, you used everything, right? And when clothes wore out, there were rags, but you didn't throw them out. Do I have it here?
Yes, it's down here.
Where is it?
Here.
Thank you. This is a rag rug that Mom made. Okay? And this is a small one. See, they're usually 5 or 6 feet long and oval shaped in the living room. Those were our rugs on the floor. And you could look at this and say, "Oh, there's Pop's shirt," or whatever. Okay. Another thing about farm life, we had a wood lathe. Oh, what happened here? Where is it? Here it is. In the shop. And in one of my careers, I was a teacher in Bad Axe. And I was president of the Bad Axe Education Association. And my dad made this gavel for me. I think it's so cool. It's simple, yes. but it's cool. I'll treasure this.
And the rocking chairs.
Oh yeah, and for the Joe and Jerome twins, he made rocking chairs, little rocking chairs, and we have one of them. He also made Adirondack chairs, which our niece Ann has, in Cleveland, Ohio, or near Cleveland. Made boats, rowboats. I remember working on them. Well, no, I didn't. They weren't doing that when I was growing up very much. They were already done. Oh boy, what else?
Doodlebug.
Oh yeah. Mechanization came slow to the Bufka farm. I'll get to it. In the 1910 or so, I think they bought a binder, which would cut the wheat or oats and bind it up in shocks. And the shocks should be gathered up and put into the threshing machine when they came, instead of doing that by hand. They bought I may have mentioned this already, but they bought a cream separator in the early 1900s so they could separate the cream. And then the first tractor we had was a doodlebug. And I thought that was something pretty unique to us. And I Googled that too and found out there are doodlebugs all over the country. All it is a homemade tractor. And this is what ours was. Oh, I got there too soon.
Yeah.
Sorry. When I was here in July, somebody asked me what was it? And I do have an answer to that question now.
Okay. Jerome described Doodlebug this way. One winter, Dad made a tractor out of a 1926 Dodge car and a Model T truck rear end. It also had an extra 2-speed shift in it. He called a Lincoln shift. We did a lot of farm work with it, and on weekends, us boys, Joe, Jerome, and Ray, would drive along the Lake Michigan beaches.
Yep. Also drove it to Shetland School. I do not remember riding it to Shetland School, but I was told that Joe did. Joe drove it, and primarily because Kenny was unable to walk to school, so he could ride. He had a congenital heart defect, by the way, and that's why he died. Okay.
Funerals.
Oh yeah. Also, something unique, not probably unique to the Bufka farm, but unique to the time period. And it really had a huge impression on me. When Kenny died, he was laid out in the living room. Today, most people would think that was terrible. And I thought that for a long time. But I think that's really intimate. And I didn't appreciate it at the time. I didn't understand at the time. I was only 6 years old. But there's something really intimate about that. And when Aunt Celia died in 1951, she was the one who was single in Chicago. She was laid out here as well in the living room. So needless to say, 1947, he died in October. That was a pretty raw year that year, and Christmas was terrible. In fact, our dad, the story is that he had a heart attack that year and didn't do much for almost a year. But he was, it's easy to say, I mean, he was devastated, no doubt about that. What else? There's something else.
Mock wedding.
Hmm?
Mock wedding.
Oh yeah, yeah. We have a picture of a mock wedding in the house in the 1930. Well, no, happy 1931, because my brother Joe was in the picture, and he was born in October 1930. And that intrigued me. A mock wedding was, it acted like a wedding. There was a bride and a groom, and you had a party. Yeah. Robert Viscatzel was the groom, and Pauline Demeyer, who was a friend of my mom's from Indiana, was the bride. Interestingly, neither one of those ever married. You think they got scared? Is this what weddings? Okay, what else?
That's about it.
That's about it. Okay, time for questions. Oh wait, I do have one more thing. I am delighted to be here and to share this with you. I'd be happy to do it again. And I thank the Park Service and Preserve and whoever else is maintaining these buildings and this property so that people can enjoy it. And I hope someday that they can enjoy it even a lot more. And I'd be happy to come back again as long as I'm able. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you, thank you. Are there any questions? Because I have answers.
Hey, Norb, Scott Tucker with the park.
Yeah,
You're always welcome.
thank you,
We'll put a calendar together for you.
thank you.
We can schedule you out. No, I really appreciate you taking the time today and seeing the names I've seen over the years. You know, you didn't really get to it, but I'm curious of sort of the family's perspective of 1970, that shift, and from almost 100 years of history on this piece of ground to someone walking and knocking on your door asking you to sell the property. And I may have been telling you to sell the property. I'm curious of your recollection of that 1970s piece.
My husband will be here in a half hour to tell you.
1972?
No.
What?
When you sold the
When
farm.
you sold.
When I sold the farm,
What was
1979.
the
What was
family's?
the family perspective?
You don't really want to know.
Actually, I do, but
Yeah, okay. You probably know.
I was 9 at the time, so
Really? Oh. No, there was great opposition to the sale. And I was very much involved with that. I hated it too. I didn't want it sold. And we fought it for years. And we got the letter from James Williamson, if you don't sell, we'll condemn the property. So we sold. I only found out later that that was not legal. He had no right to say that. Is that true?
that's why I've heard many of those stories.
That's the story I heard as a
Right, right.
I've heard many of those stories. I haven't driven into each individual land file.
Sure,
But
sure.
I've heard numerous stories of bullying and pressure.
So since then, I mean, for me, I didn't live here. As I mentioned before, I moved away in 1956 and never really lived here again, except in the summer for a while, a few summers. But I love the place, as I mentioned at the beginning. And since we don't own it anymore, I want it available to as many people as possible to see what can be done, see what happened here, tell the story somehow. I appreciate the sign that was put up. I didn't realize it was here until I came in July. So that's a good start. Oh, another aspect of Bufka farm life was hunting. And all my brothers hunted. Hunting. I went with John one time squirrel hunting. There was a squirrel 20 feet in front of me, and I missed it twice. And I said, the heck with it. And I never hunted again. I went fishing with my dad. Didn't catch anything. Didn't go fishing again.
Norbert,
Yes.
It's Larry.
there was a story about when Gerald Ford was our president and he came to Traverse City for the Cherry Festival. And for some reason they were going out past the Gallagher farm. Margaret can tell the story probably better. But anyway, they sent these scouts out ahead to clear the roads and everything. And so they started out, and about the time they got out to Gallagher's, her dad, I think it was, that let the cows out and they went across the road.
Oh.
Stopped the whole procession.
Yeah.
They had to stop and wait for the cows to go
Yep.
across.
That made the Record Eagle front
Yeah.
page.
Yep. Yep.
Norbert, I have 2 questions.
Sure.
One is kind of a follow-up to Scott's of how did you reconcile or make peace with being opposed to the sale of the farm, and then to today, to being able to sit here and share this and want to see things done with the farm. and then the other one is about electricity in the dam.
Oh yeah, I forgot that. Thank you. And there's water too. Remind me, I'll talk about water.
Okay.
For me, it was a gradual transition, but basically, it's done. The farm is sold. We're never going to own it again. Get over it. I'm telling myself that, not anybody else. Me. That's how I did it. And that's why I think it's a great honor to our grandparents and parents to have this preserved and marked and what's the word I want? And verified and the story told. I believe that. Give you a little philosophy. Native Americans could not understand private ownership of property. It all belonged to everybody. And the general history of the world is that. Mother Earth, we say. It's the source of life. We don't own this. We didn't. We had custody of it for a while. That's all. That's my philosophy. That helped me too. Anyway. So electricity, yes, I forgot that one. In 1927, well, I'll go back earlier. I think even maybe before 1900, I don't know when the Leland Dam was built, but they started producing electricity there, and Northern Power and Light Company, I'm not sure that's the name of it, and they extended the line to the Bufka farm. In 1927, my father helped put up the poles and the lines for that, and we were at the end of the electric line. This is the end of that particular line. It still is today. Consumers has it now, of course.
I remember, you remember putting the ice blocks in sawdust? Is that how you preserved them?
I was too,
Because we had an ice house and the ice was always put in the sawdust
right, yes,
to keep it.
yes, yes.
We did too.
Yeah, there was sawdust between each block, each layer,
Yep.
and also between, how did they put it between them? Anyway, yeah. And of course the reason for that is, well, two things, as I understand it, insulation, but also to take the block off, you could do that instead of, because if it's sitting there with another block, it would freeze,
Frozen right
it'd be freeze together, right? Right.
When I was a kid, a little kid, Dad used to take some of the neighbors and they'd go down to the lake in the wintertime, cut blocks of ice out, and pull it out, and then haul it home.
Yeah,
That's what we did. And of course, we live right on that little lake now.
right.
But, because we got a piece of property that was my dad's, that I built on, so.
Yeah, I mentioned that Larry's dad did cut ice, and I'm sure I got the story from Larry. He would go out the day before and cut the ice, so the next day when they came to get the blocks, it was easy to get the blocks, and wouldn't have to wait for to be cut, which I thought was interesting.
I don't remember it at all. I just remember the ice house and the sawdust. So I must have been pretty young when we got electricity.
I remember the ice house being in our dining room when we go in. I'll show you where. That's the first room you go into in the house, and I remember the ice block being at the top of the ice box. And we were touring someplace and they had an ice box, and the ice was on the bottom, and I thought, that's backwards. And I thought, well, I guess they know what they're doing, but because the ice, cold air settles, so it makes sense for the ice block to be on top. Of course, then those of you who don't know about ice box, then there was a tray underneath, and when the ice melted, you had to empty that tray.
Nor, did you have a root cellar?
Yes, I heard you, yes. I hesitant how to answer that because that threw me. We have a cellar, yes. And we had, I guess you'd call it a root cellar because that's where we stored our potatoes. It's a dirt floor. That would be a root cellar, right? It's below the house.
It's the basement of the house.
Oh, okay.
Right. Yeah, our cellar is under the house. And I'll explain more of that when we go in the house. There was something else.
Water.
Yeah, the water. Okay, right behind us there's a platform. That was as a well platform. Beneath there is a space in the ground where there was a dug well, and there was a pump there, which is where Charles Bufka and Mary Bufka got their water for the house. That pump was still there when I was a kid, and we could still use it. I don't know at what point they disconnected it, but then, yeah, this is really important, that I missed. Water came inside. We had indoor plumbing in 1933, and I have the record of this. They had a bathroom installed in the house that year. Now, just to put that in perspective, 1933. Mom had 3 kids under 3 years old, and a 4th one coming in 34. So can you imagine not having indoor plumbing and with those kids, babies? Let's see, what else is there?
How about, could you explain a little bit more about social life? What you did for fun? Farms were a lot of work, but what did you do for fun?
Thank you for asking that. It's a wonderful question. We had no fun. No, I'm kidding. We played cards. Dances were big, but although I was not involved in that, but I mentioned that earlier. Our parents went to dances. I do remember going with them to watch them dance. Square dances were big. My dad played the fiddle. Did I say that? I loved to hear him play the fiddle, but at Cleveland Town Hall there were dances, and George Shelder played the piano, and I forget who played the accordion. But there was that. We played, in fact, I would ask my dad, when I was growing up, I would ask my dad on Sunday afternoon, get out the violin and play for me. And he would until he just couldn't do it anymore. We played euchre.
A lot of euchre.
Right. And we played, I think euchre became more popular after we grew up than when we were kids. Because I remember our dad did not like to play cards. I remember him playing euchre once or twice, and under protest. And because Mom was the one who wanted to play euchre. In fact, when she was in a nursing home close to, well, a couple years before she died, we all went up there one time, and I said, Mom, would you how about playing cards? She practically jumped out of bed. Not literally, of course, but that was her attitude. Oh, she loved to play euchre. And she loved to euchre her kids. Let's see, what else? Oh yeah, this ties in with how talented our dad was. We had sleighs and skis that were homemade. He made a sleigh with a steering wheel. I think that's kind of unique. I never heard of that. I don't know. Do you know where that is, John?
Yeah,
Oh, good. Where?
in the barn.
Yeah, okay.
That's the cooler.
Yeah, okay, good. I mean, that's something that should be preserved as well. I don't know what you do with it, but so we could, and with the slopes here, the farm, by the way, goes over on the other side of the ridge, and there's farmland over there. I forgot to mention this. By the time my father was in the 30s and 40s, there's probably 60, I estimate 60 to 65 acres of tillable land out of the 200. So that's a lot more, but there are a lot of hills. And the skis, I didn't do very well on skis. I remember Adolf Iskov talking about homemade skis and skiing from his place, which is near Sugarloaf Mountain, down to Shetland School. And
It's about 10 to 3.
Adolf Iskov
Okay,
was our
thank you.
Raleigh man. Did you ever have a Raleigh man come to your house?
Oh yeah, that was
He was
Adolf.
our Raleigh man.
Adolf was a salesman, yeah. Yep, he came, he loved it. I have his, Karen Viscatil, his daughter, asked me to write his story. So that's one of my books, Adolf and Clara Viscatil. And yeah, he wrote about that. He loved being a salesman. And it was fun I was a kid, but it was fun to see him come, and they'd chat, and I don't know if my mom ever bought anything, but.
Well, my mother did.
Yeah, Mom always bought their vanilla.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Shall we move to more questions, or do you want to start the tour?
Tour.
Tour. Well, you can ask questions on the tour as well. So all the buildings are open, is that right?
A few of them are. I'll open up any more that we need along the way.
Okay, the house is
House
open.
is open.
Okay, let's start there and we'll see where that goes.